So on Monday afternoon, the power went out at my house, and seeing as how I live out in the country and we are on a well, the water went out too. And an hour or two later, when the power came back on, for some reason, the water did not. And so we called up my father-in-law, who we bought the house from, to see if he had any tricks that he could suggest. And we fiddled with the circuit breaker, made sure that the circuits for the pump hadn't tripped. And we fiddled with the little control box on top of the pressure tank down in the basement, but to no avail. So I called up the pump guy. By now it was about 8 o'clock at night. And he said, "Well, do you want me to come out tonight?" And I said, "No, that's not really necessary." He said, "Well, that's good, because it's my 29th wedding anniversary." And I said, "Definitely do not come tonight. It'll be okay." And he said, "All right, I'll see you at 7 o'clock in the morning." So I went to bed that night, imagining the possibility that the worst case might happen, and we would have to excavate the well pump housing, which is buried about 2 feet underneath our driveway. And also the possibility that I might need to come here for a full day of meetings and Bible study and all of that without having had a shower. And that made me think of this gospel lesson today. And the Pharisees and the scribes who come down from Jerusalem to check up on Jesus, and who notice that some of his disciples are eating without having first washed their hands. Now, what's at stake here is not hygiene. Let's be very clear. There's no germ theory at work in first century Palestine. But there was a religion of purity and a very complex kind of purity map of society centered on the temple in Jerusalem and the Holy of Holies within the temple, which was the holiest place. And kind of as you went out from there, things got successively less holy. And pretty soon you were in Gentile territory, which was completely unholy. And there were a whole lot of other ways in which people imagined that God had ordered the universe in such a fashion as to make everything kind of whole and consistent within the kind of thing that it was, and separate from every other kind of thing. And the purity was largely a matter of just keeping everything in its proper place. And if things started to sort of leak out and blur over into places where they didn't belong, and contaminate other kinds of things, then you had to purify them. So, hence lots of ritual ablutions to restore purity when things had gotten, somewhat less than pure. And the Pharisees were concerned with this holiness of the people of God and wanting everybody to be holy as God is holy. developed a very strict interpretation of the oral law around these practices of purification, especially as it related to meals. So they would gather for their meals, having made sure that they were pure and everything they ate was pure. And so they shared in the holiness of the priests in the temple itself, wherever they happened to be, so that the dinner table in their homes where they gathered was like an extension of the temple, a place of holiness, like the holiness of the holy temple in Jerusalem. And they, taught that everybody should strive to do the same thing, which is one reason why they had such a hard time with Jesus. Because he had this way of eating with all different kinds of people, without regard for how holy they were. And in fact, he recognized that there were a whole lot of people in the society his time who could not be pure. It just wasn't possible for them because of their occupations or because they were so deeply in debt that they couldn't afford to pay the temple tithes, which were necessary to ensure one's holiness. So he put forward kind of a different vision, a different understanding of how people could be holy. It had more to do with the holiness of God, which was intimately available to everyone at all times, and in particular when they opened their hearts to one another with justice and compassion. But, the Pharisees didn't see it that way. So he gives us his teaching today about not holiness exactly, but the opposite, about defilement. And the defilement, that which makes a person unholy, is not about the things outside of oneself. It's not about making yourself look good or smell good, even. In our own society, we kind of maybe have our own version of this purity code, although it's completely secularized. But you think about those people who are without homes, maybe living in their cars, and the great lengths that they go to ensure that when they go to the store or to their jobs every day, they are washed and have clean clothes and are cleanly shaved and smell good so that people don't perceive that in fact they are homeless. Because to be homeless in our society is to fall short of that kind of middle-class respectability that makes you a real person in our society. So this question of defilement, of what makes you less than a real person, equal with other people, is what is at stake in this gospel lesson today. And what Jesus says, of course, is that what makes you unclean is not what's outside of you, but what is within you, what is in your heart. This is where, from the place from which all these evil intentions, and then he goes down the long list, all the things that originate in our hearts and come out of us in the form of bad conduct, of treating other people as objects, slander and envy and pride and folly and fornication and all the rest. That is what makes a person unclean. So it does kind of leave us wondering, well, is that all that's in our hearts? These evil inclinations that defile us? And, there have been plenty of people in Christian history who have said, yeah, that's pretty much what it boils down to. So our, Protestant Anglican tradition is deeply influenced by John Calvin and his followers, who promulgated this notion of total human depravity. That nothing can come out of our hearts except these kinds of things. But if we do a little, cross-comparison with the Gospel of Matthew, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, and chapter 5, verse 8 of Matthew, where Jesus says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And we just say that. And it suggests that, at least in the mind of Jesus, purity of heart is something that is possible for human beings. We're not so profoundly contaminated with sin that it's impossible for anything pure to come forth from our hearts. And our epistle reading today maybe gives us a little bit of insight into how it is that can happen. But before I say any more about that, I want to go back to Tuesday morning when I got up very early because the pump guy, you'll remember, was well-end pump guy, was going to come at 7 o'clock. And I wanted to go down to the barn and get the mower off of the tractor in case I needed to use the bucket on the tractor to dig a 2-foot deep hole in my driveway to access the well head housing. So I wanted to be ready in case of the worst case scenario. And I walked out of my house onto the back patio, put on my boots, feeling somewhat anxious about what was going to happen that day. And I looked up in the sky where the first light of dawn was just beginning to appear over the eastern mountains, and saw a perfect equilateral triangle of the waning crescent moon and Jupiter and Mars. And the book of James tells us that the Father of lights has given us a new birth by the word of truth. That we are creatures of God, just like the moon, and Jupiter, and Mars. And this God, whose nature is always to be creating, always to be giving life, whose grace and favor toward everything that God has made does not vary, never changes. God is always fathering forth God's creation, and that includes us. And when we know that we are creatures in kinship with everything else that God has made, and in particular, when we understand what kind of creatures we are, maybe then we can begin to understand this purity of heart that enables us to see God. And And what kind of creatures are we, says the letter of James? We are the first fruits of God's creatures. And of course, in the Hebrew Bible, the first fruits of the harvest are those things that are offered back to God. And that is maybe, I'm going to suggest that it is, our true human vocation that leads us beyond our sinful inclinations, when we can recognize ourselves as creatures, but a very special kind of creatures, the priests of the holiness of God, who offer back to God all that God has made, in gratitude, in love, in thanksgiving and adoration and praise, offering back to God the whole created universe in art and dance and music and poetry and acts of kindness and generosity and compassion, in prayer and worship, being the first fruits of God's creatures, offering back to God everything that God continually gives to us on behalf of all creation. And so becoming pure in heart, and so becoming capable of seeing